Today, we're diving into the world of podcast guesting. It's such a powerful tool for building your personal brand and obviously, subsequently, growing your business. I'm bringing you a conversation with Victoria Bennion, and I have to say, I'm so excited about this one. When I look for guests, I'm always searching for that perfect blend of expertise and actionable advice. Victoria and I met in San Diego for the first time, and then we reconnected in England last summer when I spoke at Atomicon. And after one conversation with her, I knew I needed to have her on the Real Personal Branding podcast. Victoria is the founder of the Best Podcast Guest Booking Agency, where she helps business owners and authors leverage podcast interviews to amplify their message. She also hosts the Best Guest podcast and co-authored The Most Amazing Marketing Book Ever with Mark Schaefer. In this conversation, we're covering so many topics, but specifically how to craft the perfect pitch that gets you on the right podcasts. We all want that, right? Finding the best podcast opportunities that align with your brand, and best practices for being a guest that host loves and listeners remember. Victoria has some of the most practical insights from someone who's been in the trenches, helping entrepreneurs like you and me expand their reach through podcast appearances. So if you are ready to do this, if you're ready to get on podcasts, this is the conversation that you need to hear. And I am so excited. Let's get started. Welcome to the show, Victoria. I'm so happy that you're here.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. I'm really pleased to be here as well.
Yay. Okay, so you and I met in San Diego, and then we reconnected this summer in England, and I got to know you over meals and drinks and cheers. But for anyone that doesn't know you, catch us up on your story. Why did you start your business, and why is it so important to you?
Okay. So I started my business in 2019, and I'd been working with authors at the time, more in a general marketing sense. And I'd done a course to update my skills, and I'd learned about how podcast interviews could be really helpful for authors wanting to get the word out about their books. So that's what led me into trying it out with the clients that I had. And I found that it worked so well for them. And I really enjoyed doing it and just seeing their great results. So that's when I decided to focus all in on podcasts. And it was just really important to me because I want to get our clients great results. And this seemed like an excellent way to do that.
Do you have some success stories that you have seen the power of getting on a podcast interview, having a great interview, being the best podcast guest, and how that really helped your business? What kinds of success stories have you seen?
Yeah, so many. So the first client that I was telling you about, so he'd just written a book on leadership, and I actually met him in the Facebook group that came along with the course. So he'd done the course I did, but he was running a business and he wanted to get on podcast, but he didn't have the time to do it himself. So he asked if anyone in the group, could do it. So I said that I would, not fully knowing what I was doing at that point. But one of the things that really surprised me, one of the results that really surprised me, was we sent out his one sheet to a company that had a podcast, and they just came back and they said, oh my gosh, he just looks perfect for delivering a series of webinars for us. And so can we just speak to him? So kind of bypassed the podcast. I think he was on the podcast, but it was like I was just showing them who he was, almost like sending a CV or something, and he was what they were looking for. So he got a series of webinars that he did for them. And another company that I contacted, again about the podcast, but they took him on as a consultant, which was what he did, some consulting work. So that was kind of the first results that I saw. But he got increased speaking engagements, and book sales as well. So that was kind of the first results that I saw. But more recently, we worked with a health client, and I think this is just a really good one for sometimes when I speak to people about being a guest on podcasts, they can be really focused on how many download numbers does it have. And sometimes they spend quite a bit of time explaining that it's not really, shouldn't be your focus. because the benefits for being a guest on podcasts, they come in so many different ways. So our client, so in the health industry, he sells a program, and we booked him on a show. It was not a big show, but it was really right for his niche. He was connecting with the right person, and he got on really well with the host, and she became interested in working with him. And I would say it was about 6 months later. So she kept in contact and she signed up and bought his course. And that program, sorry. And that program was sold for $10,000. So I think that's a really good example that I love, because it was a small podcast, but sometimes that host, that connection you make with the host is what's so valuable.
That is so true. I think, what do you tell people when they are so focused on the numbers? You said there are so many more benefits to being on a podcast than just the number of downloads or the number of listeners. What would you say to someone who is really focused on those numbers? How do you kind of shift or change their mindset about that?
Yeah, so by talking about what those benefits are, that's one way. So, you're building the know, like, and trust factors with the audience. You've got the SEO benefits. You're often going to get backlinks from the shows that you're on, from the show notes, and then that's going to help your website traffic and you to be more visible. When somebody searches for you, you're going to show up. Your podcast interviews are going to show up. It's really helpful for authority, credibility. That person that might be thinking about working with you, or perhaps they found you by searching a keyword that you talked about, they're able to click on that interview and they're able to listen to it. And it's an asset. That podcast interview that you did is an asset. It's not going anywhere. It's like, think of it more like YouTube than, a fast moving Facebook post or something. And they can listen to you and they can still book a call with you or however you work and be pre-sold by the time you get to speak to them, because they've spent that time listening to you. They often know what you're about. I had a client and we booked her on a series of podcasts. She was a coach and she loved cats. She had lots of cats, and she talked on this podcast about having her black cat. And she said that one of the listeners booked a call, became a client, but said when she heard her talking about her cat, she knew she was her kind of person.
I love that.
It's a great way to differentiate yourself as well. I tell them that it's a great way to create content. So if you're a guest on podcasts, you can repurpose that content and it can give you such a great flow that you can use across your channels. So it's a good time saver as well. And also, often hosts will have newsletter subscribers, they'll have followers on their social media platforms. And sometimes those numbers can be even bigger than the download numbers if that's where the focus is. And so hosts usually often promote their shows to their wider audiences. So you're getting this additional exposure. And it might be to different people. They may not have actually listened to your podcast episode in the first place. So, and it's a great way to expand your network. It's a great networking tool as well. So that's some of them.
These are all great, fantastic points, and they have nothing to do with those vanity metrics of number of downloads or listeners. And I always think about how intimate the experience of having a podcast or listening to a podcast is, you are listening to it while you're in the shower or while you're on a drive and you can't do anything else with your hands. You can't scroll Instagram at the same time. You are spending time with someone that you have given permission to be in their ears. And so I know with my podcast, I take great responsibility in that. And I love the way that you talk about it, which is why I have you on the show right now. So we're going to get into all of these technical things because I hear a lot of questions about this stuff a lot, especially in my mastermind groups. People are like, I would love to get on more podcasts. How do I get on more podcasts? What are some of the best practices? So I have a whole list of questions. Hopefully you don't mind me just kind of grilling you into all of these questions here that I have, and I'm excited to get started. So thank you for being here. The first thing I want to talk about is about getting on podcasts. The next thing I want to talk about is about like best practices for being a guest on podcasts. So I'll give you some questions there. And then just some general things that I have some questions about. So the first thing I want to talk about is targeting the right fit. Because what I told my mastermind attendees and clients is that you want to get on podcasts where you know the audience is a good overlapping audience for you. You want to really do your research on those audiences, right? So what strategies do you recommend for entrepreneurs to identify the podcasts that align with their niches and their audiences? What are some strategies that you have there?
Okay, so say it's an author who is looking to be on podcasts. What they could do is have a think about where their book would sit on a shelf, which other authors, if it was in a bookshop and you went in, maybe 5 other authors who are going to be next to you. And then you can Google them with the word podcast and see what shows have they been on. I would start with a long list that you can go to. Actually, that will work. You know, you can think about, if you're not an author, you can think about your competitors or other people in your space, and you can make a note of them and you can Google them. You can actually go down a whole rabbit warren with this, because then once you find those podcasts, you can look down on the guests that they've had on as well. And maybe there are some aligned talking about similar things. What other shows have they been on? And then you can have another search. You can Google that. That could be. But to know if the podcast is a good fit for you as well, look at the description. Hosts will often say in the description who this show is for. And so it's important that you know who your audience is. Who is it that you want to speak to? If you dial that back a bit. And once you know that, that's when you can go out with these methods and start finding the right shows.
That is such a good strategy. I love that tip. That is great. And it is a great way to do some market research. And it's completely ethical to go see what your competitors are doing, where they are showing up, even if they are competitors that are your friends and in the same industry. It's like, what podcasts have they been on? What podcasts can I bring additional value to, saying things in a different way that people might understand a different way, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
What about crafting like the perfect pitch? I know that I get pitched all the time in my email, and so many of them are so bad. Like, they're just so bad. It's clear that they never knew about my show until they Googled, a list of shows, or used ChatGPT to just come up with a list of names of shows. It's clear that they don't know who my audience is. A lot of times it's just very cringy. And I hate saying that, because I really want to give everyone a chance. And I really cannot say this enough, that I read every single pitch, because I am looking to see if maybe it was just a bad pitch and the person is great, like I really am looking to see, is this a person that would make sense for my audience to share them with my audience, right? So let's talk about crafting the perfect pitch. Can you share some tips for creating a compelling pitch that stands out to podcasters, that would stop? Because I know a lot of people just delete those. I actually do read them. A lot of people delete them. Is there some kind of strategy or tip you can share for creating that kind of compelling pitch that does stand out to podcasters, and any common mistakes that you see all the time that people should avoid?
Okay, so I can share what works pretty well for us. To listen to the show first. Number one, listen to it and look for something that you connect with. And then let the host know that you've listened to it and what you connected with. If when you're listening through, you don't find something you connect with, and you go through a couple and you don't, then it's probably not the right show for you. So that's quite important too. We like to leave 5 stars on iTunes and say that we've done it. Just to demonstrate that we're not about just taking. We want your show to be successful. So it's just a small way, and it doesn't take very long. So we find hosts usually appreciate that. Say a little bit about yourself, but not too much. It can be tricky to get the right balance. Also, let the host know that you know who their audience is. So, given your audience of coaches or entrepreneurs in the leadership field, I wondered if you'd be interested. This is who I am, and this is what I could talk about. You could even say, if you look down the episodes that have been covered, you can, if you spot a gap, is there something that, or maybe an episode with somebody similar, like we were talking about, somebody in your field, but they didn't talk about X, what could you add to the conversation? So just make it easy for the host. And I would also say, if you're prepared to share, if you're on the show and you're prepared to share the episode, say that you would, how you would. And if you've got a notable, you've got a reasonable amount of followers or subscribers or engaged subscribers, or so you can add that. But just again, be thinking of what's in it for the host, what's in it, what value am I going to bring? What am I going to do to show you? I just don't want to borrow your audience, but I want to help you as well. And well, we like to put together a one sheet. I don't know if your pictures come with that, so I would encourage anyone pitching a show to attach a one sheet or a link to a media kit or both. Just make it really easy for the host to say yes.
I love that.
If I'll add on one more thing, make sure that, so you like the pitch you're talking about, and then you go and look up the person, make sure that marries up. What they're going to find when they Google you is it marries up with what you've said in the pitch or you've put on your one sheet, because you don't want to leave that room for doubt. If there's that gap and the host doesn't know you, you could just lose it. I had a client who had a marketing podcast, and she said she got this pitch and the potential guest said that she'd spoken at these events. And when the host looked her up, she couldn't find any evidence of it. She said, maybe she had, but I couldn't find it. And I didn't have ages and ages to search. So it was just a no, because it was that disconnect.
So good. These tips are so great. And if you could see me on camera, I'm just like nodding furiously because this is all so true. One time I actually wrote back because the pitch was so misaligned with what I found online. I wrote back to the person pitching and I said, hey, totally, no, this is not your situation. But when I Googled him, all I get is mugshots. And there was no link to his personal branding, and it's maybe not his mugshot. I don't know, because I don't have a picture. I can't see who this is that I'm Googling. So you might want to look into the whole, can I find you situation? Am I able to assess that who I'm having on my podcast is the real deal, right?
Yeah.
So thank you so much for that tip. That is golden. Okay, one thing I talk about a lot is building relationships with the people that you are going to ask something of, right? Not building it for the ask, not building it in a transactional way, but actually giving generously, showing up. And then when it comes time to pitch yourself or ask for something or ask for a favor or ask for a share of some sort, you generally get a better result because you have been giving so generously without expecting anything in return. That being said, how important is it to build relationships with podcasters before pitching, even lightly, not as deep as what I'm talking about, but just in the grand scheme of everything? How important is it to build relationships with podcasters, and what are some effective ways that, if it is important, what are some effective ways that people can do that?
I think it's always helpful. So you can follow them on social media. So that's probably one of the easiest ways. Like and comment on some posts, or sign up to their email list and reply back. And then you're a name, you're somebody they know already. So I think it can be helpful to absolutely take the time to do that. Or perhaps it's somebody that you see at an event. So, and they've got a podcast that you might want to pitch. So go and say hello, make sure they know who you are. And then when you come to pitch and your name pops up in their inbox or application form, they see they're more inclined to read it.
Yeah, I would say that I've found that experience to be true as well. Sometimes I hear people say things like, oh, I don't want to promote this event because I feel like it'll look like I'm too low in the game or something the real big professional speakers, they don't promote things that same way, or like super professional podcasters wouldn't go follow you ahead of time. They would just send their assistant to book them. What do you feel about that? I mean, I know I have an opinion about this. I believe in being very authentically yourself and not putting on a big front. And I've also had to overcome a lot of this in my life and asked myself, like, am I professional enough to work with this client? That was one of my limiting beliefs for a long time. So what do you think about going and following people or pitching yourself versus having someone pitch for you? What are some of the, I guess, best practices around showing up authentically with someone who pitches you? All of those things. Give me what your thoughts are when I've been babbling on and on here.
So my thoughts are that it's important to show up authentically, to be genuine and heartfelt in what you say, and, wanting to give generously. That's my feeling. I think that it's a great way to make connection to the right people if you're yourself. So I do agree with that. In terms of like having someone else pitch for you, I would say, so we obviously work with a lot of hosts who are happy to have pitches from agencies, but I think that you have to make sure that the communication is good then with the client. So say I pitched you one of our clients and you said, yes, come on. So what we try to do is to make sure that that's then very seamless, that they are well briefed in what your podcast is, what you expect, how they can be a great guest, all those things, so that, you would see us as a benefit, a help, not a hindrance.
No, that is so, I love that you just said that, because again, I have accepted a pitch that came from like an agency who helped somebody get booked on my podcast. And when they showed up, they didn't know why they were on my podcast, what my podcast was about. They weren't ready for it. And so that is the difference between working with someone like you. And if you are planning on hiring someone to help you pitch yourself to podcasts, it's a good idea to look for someone who has a company like Victoria, or to work with Victoria. Please work with Victoria, but to work with somebody who actually does the research and then also prepares you. So to me, it looks like it's a benefit on my side as the podcaster, but it's also a benefit on the guest side because they're showing up prepared. They're doing the research. So make sure that whoever you hire or whoever you have doing your pitches actually is doing that kind of work in the background. That is a big, big step. And I think that would make it incredibly seamless and important from my perspective. Okay, how about utilizing social media? What roles does social media play in getting noticed by podcasters, by getting that organic reach out? Like, hey, can you come on my podcast? How can entrepreneurs leverage that effectively?
Okay, so actually, I think when you invited me on, I had shared a post about being on a podcast.
Yes.
So I think that's something really useful to do. So if you are being a guest on podcasts, say that you are. And another thing, promote the show that you're on, because any potential host looking at you is going to see that you support the shows that you're on as well.
So true.
Yeah, so that can be really helpful. In terms of social media, yeah, so as we talked about, connecting, I think, supporting posts, they're all really good ways. Also, there's the Facebook groups that you can join where people post that they are looking for guests, or you can post that you are looking for shows. So you could utilize them as well. It's great for your visibility, the podcast, social media, as we talked about, your personal branding. So you are becoming visible, so people will see you. I mean, we had a client actually who he puts out a lot of content. So he's quite well known in the UK. He's a speaker. He is very visible. He's very known. But, there was a podcast that he really, really wanted to be on. And it's a very big one. and they came to him through his Instagram account because of his visibility. And I think so it's really important. Obviously, it depends. So where you are in your business journey, not everyone is up there putting out 100 pieces of content a week. But whatever you can do to increase your visibility, to increase your discoverability, that's all going to be really helpful. And hosts, not all hosts, but your social media platforms can be important to some hosts more than others. So they will look at the following, they will look at your following, they may look at the engagement on your posts, because I think a lot of people that run podcasts, they're looking to grow their shows, they're looking for amplification as well. So yeah, it's important. And also I have been in the position where I have pitched a client and he's great, he's successful, he's got a book coming out, but he didn't do social media. And I had a host just come back and the line was, this is a great pitch. He sounds great, but I can't find him on social media. And I think that's weird. And that was it, end of conversation.
Wow.
So, yeah.
Yeah, I think you're sharing some very valuable information here. And I like what you said about engagement, looking for engagement, because I think that's absolutely true. I don't care how many followers you have or how many likes you get on a post, but I do care when I look through your social media, I care to see if you are building an organic community or if everything looks robotic, planned, and like you're not really there. I want to know that your people pay attention to what you say, that they care about what you say, that you're helping people. That really aligns with my core values. And so that would make me choose you over someone else who maybe doesn't really care about building their community, about building better businesses with people. That I think just what you said is so helpful. Okay, so let's talk about best practices for being a guest.
Okay.
When you're preparing for an interview, what preparation steps do you recommend for people before they appear on a podcast? How can they ensure that they're going to provide the best value during the episode? You've talked about how you prep people, you tell them about the podcast, you kind of get them ready for that show. I would love to know more steps about that. Like, how do you prepare to be the best possible guest and to make it so that podcast host is like, you got to meet my friend. I know that you would be perfect for their show as well.
Yeah. Okay. So the first thing that we do when we get a yes from a host is we would have a look at the format of the show. It's really important to know, is it audio or is it video as well, so that you can be prepared. For example, I have talked to people and they've thought that it's audio, and they've turned up with wet hair and it was video and they're not so comfortable, So you want to know what platform. Now, most hosts are probably going to share this with you, but they may not, or it may be just before. So I would say also you can be more comfortable if you know these things. If you're like, right, okay, I'm going to be on video, so I'll make sure that my background looks okay, that my hair's dried. Also, platform-wise, maybe it's a platform that you haven't used before. So you might want to have a little bit of time to check it out beforehand and get the hang of how it works. I would also ask if there's likely to be any advanced questions. Is there anything that you should be prepared for? If you've listened to the show when you pitched, but when you get the yes, I'd listen to another episode. Is there a question that the host always asks? For example, I know when I was on Tim Lewis's show, and they always asked the question about the llama farm. I think it's the llama farm. If you were trying to get the owner of the llama farm podcast, how would you do it? So you don't want to be taken by surprise.
Right.
So do your preparation. So that's number one. Think through what your call to action is going to be, I would say, just so you're not kind of a mess at the end of the show. Like if the host says, oh, where could listeners connect with you? Know where you're going to say, so you're not kind of, oh, what's my link for Instagram? I can't remember, or, just kind of be clear. So in terms of being a good guest, also so connect with the host on social media so that if they're sharing any posts about your upcoming interview, you can share them and you can be promoting it to your audience. This is really important as well if it's a live podcast, which it might be, that you are doing your part. This, hosts appreciate that. Make sure that all your audio is working beforehand, that you know how to select the right microphone. It's always good to have some basic equipment, and there's a really low barrier to being a guest on podcasts, but it's going to sound much better if you've got an external microphone, you're wearing headphones, and for those shows that are video as well, that you've got a webcam. It's like your inbuilt microphone is certainly it's not really good enough. So I'd make those investments, and probably a ring light. I'd make those investments before you get going, because that's going to help you to be a good guest. One of the things that you really don't want to do is commit to being a guest on podcasts, even get as far as the interview and find that the host can't use your recording. The audio was too poor, the lighting was too poor. And think through what you're going to share and how you're going to share it. So I know you vaguely sort of touched on this at the beginning, but you don't want a guest who's going to come on and sell. And I know if perhaps you've written a book or something, but the aim of being on the podcast is not to push that book. You can weave in mentions of the book, but you want to add value to the audience. So know how you're going to do that. It can be useful to write some headers if you like to write things down and have maybe 3 bullet points. Think of anecdotes you can share, stories, maybe some facts or figures. But we as listeners, we connect with stories, we remember that so much more. And that's going to make for a really good podcast episode too, that people want to listen to, rather than somebody who's just, buy my book.
These are all excellent points. And I know that there's been a few podcast episodes that I've been on where I have been asked maybe some unexpected questions or challenging, tough questions during the interview, and I wasn't quite sure how to respond at the time. Do you have any ideas or tips about how to approach questions that maybe you're not really prepared for and maybe thinking more on the spot?
Yeah. So do you know, were the podcasts edited or live?
At the time, I believe, I've been on one live episode where it happened like that, and definitely one edited one too, where I did ask him to pause and say, like, that's not a question I can answer at this time. Yeah.
That is exactly what I would say. If it's edited and you're comfortable, just say that. That's not something I can answer, or I'm going to have to get back to you on that. And I think on the live, that's also okay. I think that can be a really big fear as well, can't it? About when you're thinking about being a guest on podcast, what if they ask me something I don't know? And it is absolutely okay to say, I'm not sure about that, but I'll find out and I can get back to you. That is the line that I would take, and that we tell our clients to take, because you just can't know everything. Or you could be a politician and you could say, the real question is, and then change it.
That is great. That is so funny. Okay. Follow-up. Let's talk about the follow-up. After you've been on a podcast, now what? What is the best way to follow up after an interview? Why is it important for building long-term relationships? Let me know a little more about that.
Okay. So if you connected with that host, you need to see your podcast as the first step in that relationship. So you want to, you want to keep that going. So thank the host for having you as a guest. That's really easy. You can be more formal. You could send a thank you card. If there was something that you talked about that you connected on, I've known clients send coffee or something, that they talked about coffee, and here's the one that I was talking about for you as a thank you gift. So that can be a nice thing to do. As we talked about, you can post on social media that you had a great interview and you can't wait for your audience to hear it, and you tag the host. And as we said, when that podcast is released, support the episode, promote it on your channels, tag the host. And this doesn't have to be just a one-time deal. You can keep promoting that to your audience. As we mentioned, you can repurpose it. So you can just keep that going every so often. I know there's somebody that I had on as a guest a couple of years ago, and every so often she does a little post pointing people back to that episode. So that's always really helpful, I think. And you can, if it makes sense, you can talk about further opportunities to collaborate.
That is the best. Thinking of it as your first step in your relationship with that host, and think about all of the opportunities that you have after that point with that initial handshake, right?
Yeah.
What are some of the common misconceptions that people have about being a podcast guest? What would you say to those? Sometimes I ask this question as, you ask, what is one common question that people ask in every podcast? A lot of times I say, let's bust one myth about what you do or about something related to what we talked about today. What is one myth that you would like to bust about being the perfect podcast guest?
Ooh. So I was going to say to you, size. That is, I do think, the biggest myth, that you have to be on the biggest show. I can't even tell you the amount of people that will initially say, can you get me on Oprah? Or can you get me on Diary of a CEO? And they think that to see results from being a guest on podcast, that's what they need to do. And as we've talked about, it really isn't. There's so many more benefits to being on the right shows, despite the number. And I think another one, I know you said one, but another myth is, sometimes if people are nervous about speaking, I would say, you don't have to be the best public speaker to do well from a podcast interview strategy, because it's actually a one-on-one conversation. So if you just block out from your mind all those other people that will be listening and focus on the conversation that you're having with one person, that's all you need to do. And then that's a lot less scary too, if you're scared.
Such a great tip. What about long-term strategy? How do podcasts fit into a broader marketing strategy for service-based entrepreneurs, for small businesses, solopreneurs?
So I would say, in terms of a podcast interview strategy, you don't have to be on a podcast a day. Again, that can be another thought people have, that they need to just go from nothing to like a daily podcast, and you don't have to do that. You can aim to do a couple of months if that fits, and make the most of each opportunity then. So repurpose them, share them, send them out to your newsletter list. It's another, it's a way to keep top of mind. You're gradually building your SEO and your backlinks. And you will find also that by being a guest on podcasts, you'll be invited on other podcasts, because people will see you, they'll know that you're speaking, you're promoting it to your audience as well. So it can snowball. So I would see it as something that you work into your marketing plan, but you don't have to go crazy about it as well.
That's great advice. And so for newbies, for people who are just getting started, they want to get on their first few podcasts, I would love for our final question here to ask you, what is your top piece of advice for getting onto their first few podcasts? What can they do starting today to kind of create a small plan for themselves?
Okay, I would start with looking at their own network. Who do they know who has a podcast that might be appropriate could they approach them and see if they could be a guest? Join some of those Facebook groups that we talked about, and keep an eye on them, see what hosts might be looking for, and if you could fit them, fit that, and put together a one sheet. So think through, if you don't have one already, think about what topics you could talk about, what questions you could answer. If you have a biography, put together a little one sheet that you can send out with your pictures, and review your digital presence. So as we talked about, if that host Googles you, just make sure you're happy with whatever shows up. If you've got some old Facebook accounts or any posts that don't reflect you or could cause that disconnect, close those down. That's probably where I would start.
And if you listen to my podcast episode where I was a guest on Victoria's podcast, you'll see that we talked a lot about this, about can people find you? How do they experience you once they do find you? How do you continue your relationship with them? And then how do you repeat that process? So we talked about all of that. We broke all of that down on Victoria's podcast. What is the name of your podcast, Victoria, so people can come find you?
It's The Best Guest.
Yes, so fitting. And where is the best place for people to connect with you after this interview?
So if they go to thebestpodcastguest.co.uk/real-personal-branding, I've put together a welcome page. So there's also the link to the podcast. And if they wanted to put together their own one sheet, we've got a free Canva template that they can use to put it together, and a checklist on how to be a good guest. So some things to get you started.
I love that. And I will get that link from you as well. We will put the link into the show notes so you can find that really easily. Thank you so much for coming on the Real Personal Branding podcast, Victoria. I'm so happy you were here.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. It's been a real pleasure to talk to you, Lauren.
That wraps up our conversation with Victoria Bennion on strategic podcast guesting. What did you think? You can find any of the links we mentioned in the show notes or at laurendaviscreative.com/show. I am always keen to hear what resonated with you. I want to know, which one Victoria strategies are you planning to implement? Which ones are you going to do? Which ones are you going to do now? Which ones are you going to do later? Come find me on Instagram and let me know at ldaviscreative, and let's connect there. And if you would like to book a call with me to talk about your own personal branding journey, or find out more about my upcoming mastermind openings or live in-person events, or download any of my free resources, you can actually find that at the link in the show notes. And hey, if you found value in Victoria's insights, give her a shout too. Share this episode, drop Victoria a message letting her know that you loved what you learned. It's these small little acts of kindness that keep entrepreneurs like me and Victoria motivated to keep sharing our knowledge with the world and keep creating podcast episodes like this one. So that is it for today. Keep building your authentic brand, and I can't wait to see you in the next episode of the Real Personal Branding Podcast. Bye.